Africa's recovery was abruptly interrupted by those instances you've just mentioned. And last year, activity had finally bounced back. But because of the worldwide slowdown, the tighter global financial conditions, as well as rising inflation, food and energy costs across most of the globe, most of the region has become vulnerable to different headwinds. And unfortunately, the situation is no different for South Africa. Joining me now to talk about this and that regional economic outlook report that's compiled by the IMF is Deputy Director at the IMF African Department, Pattillo. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, Catherine. And maybe just start by explaining to us, when you say that SSA is living on the edge, what exactly does that mean? And I suppose more importantly here, the role that the IMF has played to perhaps support the region a little more in these times.
Thank you. So the times are very, very difficult for the region right now. Very difficult. As you point out, we were seeing recovery from the pandemic last year, growth up to 4.7%. Really hit then this year with growth down to 3.6%. That's a very big hit. Why? So global growth is down, and that reduces demand for the exports from the region. Global financial conditions tightening, and so borrowing costs are rising. Access to capital markets is drying up. And the shocks from the war in Ukraine then are driving up food, fuel, fertilizer prices, increasing import costs for the region, adding then to the difficulties in food insecurity. So this then is in the face of very, very high levels of public debt and high levels of inflation, some of the highest we've seen in many years. And so for policymakers, they're quite constrained then in their ability to address these challenges. Think about, government finances where countries are really seeing strains, not all, but many, with the ability then to spend on important developmental needs at the time of these very high food and fuel costs. Yeah. And so you asked then about the IMF. We are very present, very engaged in the region. In the years since the pandemic, 50 billion has gone to the region from the IMF. And we're also doing new ways to support the countries. We've introduced recently a new food shock window to provide emergency financing for countries hit by this food crisis. And an important step forward is a new resilience and sustainability trust that we've also just operationalized that will help countries with addressing climate change for low carbon and climate resilient development.
Now, the destruction you've just described, the food insecurity, the policymakers who don't have much room to maneuver, and all the other issues are quite important to highlight because, as you say, there needs to be ways for us to find sustained solutions, if possible, in the current state. But are there any green shoots? Are you seeing any economies within the region that are able to stay resilient despite the current headwinds that we're facing?
Well, this year, as I said, growth is down. A couple types of countries are growing a little faster than average. I'd point out a couple tourism-dependent economies, which are seeing a recovery in tourism, and like Mauritius and Seychelles. A couple of commodity-rich countries who have benefited from the high commodity prices this year, Botswana, DRC, and some countries with very strong macro policies, strong macro frameworks, Rwanda, Benin. But in the medium term, I think it's really the more diversified economies that are going to be more resilient because they have then the more diversified production structures, exports that are going to allow them to be more flexible when further shocks hit, and allow them also to be more dynamic in exploiting new growth areas.
Yeah, you spoke about this in your first answer, but I want us to maybe ventilate it a little bit more, the food security issues and the impact that higher inflation has had on that. How bad is it? And are there any, from your compiling of the report and your different engagements that you would have had, is there a solution, perhaps not in the medium term, but in the longer term, the plight of the food security issues that have just been highlighted over the last year or so?
Yes, so high food inflation and climatic shocks are really driving a very devastating increase in food insecurity in the region. So food inflation is up now. It's been over 10% since the second half of 2021. It's around 12 now. This is compared to 2% in 2019. And then you're seeing this range of climatic shocks also from, the drought in the Horn of Africa, floods in South Sudan, recent floods in Chad. A lot of these shocks are also really increasing food insecurity. In fact, right now we have 120 million people, 12% of the population in the region who are acutely food insecure, and a third of those have become food insecure since the start of the pandemic. So the short-term measures to address are supporting countries so that they can be able to take the measures to help the vulnerable population. In the more medium term, it's about really addressing some of those root causes, which are going to be accentuated again with climate change. So working on adaptation to climate change and all the steps that are both important, ex ante, irrigation, weather resilient seeds, etc., and ex post, then social protection for communities hit by shocks are all going to be important to make sure that there's agricultural production and it's traded within the region through things like the free trade agreement to help with the longer term.
Yeah, and I want to bring South Africa in at this point specifically. That's probably one of the solutions that would work for us. I mean, it's been said that we're not necessarily food scarce, but food insecurity situation in the country is growing. And so mechanisms like you've just described are going to be very important. But how does South Africa then, beyond that issue, weather the kind of headwinds that we've been faced with over the last 2 years?
So the question, I think, relates a lot to some of the structural constraints to growth in South Africa. And these are areas that are, longstanding, but really what could address some of the constraints to growth that have held back growth in South Africa for over a decade. And I think they're well known. One obviously is addressing the energy and infrastructure crisis, where you see that obviously holding back growth, making it difficult for businesses to work, complicating people's daily lives, and holding back investment. Next, I'd say, and this is something common for a range of countries in the region, the need to think about moving from a more government-led economic model to a model that promotes private investment. And in the South Africa context, there are a lot of reforms that have been discussed relating to increasing competition, lowering barriers to entry for the private sector, reducing excessive regulation. And then thirdly, again, something that's key across countries in the region, continuing to work on improving governance, reducing corruption, so that people can have confidence and feel that public services are being provided in ways that are really helpful for their lives.
We can only hope our policymakers are listening to conversations like this and are taking notes, trying to better the lives of their society and community members. Thank you very much for your time this evening, Catherine. That is the Deputy Director of the IMF African Department, Catherine Pattillo, joining us this evening to discuss those regional developments over the last 2 years.